Welcome to Northvale Storyhouse. Here, every badge is tested, every lie is exposed, and every act of courage brings justice one step closer. If you believe the truth always deserves a voice, you're in the right place. Tell us where you're watching from, subscribe, and witness another unforgettable story. There are moments when authority mistakes silence for weakness, and in those moments the entire meaning of power quietly begins to change. On an ordinary afternoon in downtown Houston, Texas, the streets moved with their usual rhythm, traffic flowing past glass buildings, sunlight reflecting off steel and concrete, and people walking with the kind of focus that belongs to routines they trust without question. Among them was a man in simple civilian clothing, a plain navy jacket, khaki pants, and worn leather shoes that gave no hint of the life he carried behind his calm expression. He looked like anyone else returning from work, unremarkable to the untrained eye, but there was a precision in the way he observed everything around him, a quiet discipline in his posture that came from years of responsibility far beyond the city sidewalks. As he crossed the street near a government district checkpoint, a patrol car slowed beside him, its presence unremarkable at first until it wasn't. The officer inside studied him briefly, longer than necessary, narrowing his focus on details that didn't fit his expectations. The man's demeanor, his stillness, and the absence of visible identification markers seemed to trigger an assumption that was made too quickly and too confidently. Within moments, the officer stepped out and approached him, speaking in a firm tone that carried the weight of procedure rather than conversation. The man responded calmly, his voice steady, offering simple clarification, but calmness is often misread when it does not align with expectation. A second officer arrived, then another, and the space around them shifted as curiosity from nearby pedestrians began to gather. The man did not raise his voice, did not resist, and did not attempt to assert himself beyond words. Yet the situation continued to escalate in formality, as if certainty could be built through repetition rather than understanding. What none of them recognized in that moment was that they were speaking to someone who had spent decades operating in environments where command is earned, not announced, and where identity is not defined by appearance alone. As the interaction continued, the man complied with each request, not out of fear, but out of discipline, his gaze occasionally scanning the surroundings with a calm that unsettled those who mistook stillness for submission. A growing crowd formed at a distance, phones raised not in hostility but in confusion, sensing something unusual unfolding in a place where nothing usually breaks routine. Inside the nearest command vehicle, a radio call was made, referencing protocol and verification, and with it, the atmosphere shifted again, becoming heavier, more procedural, as if layers of authority could replace clarity. The man remained composed throughout, offering only what was necessary, his words measured, his presence unchanged even as the situation tightened around him like a structure built on assumptions. And then, without warning, a new presence entered the perimeter, not hurried, not uncertain, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to immediate recognition. The surrounding officers adjusted their posture instinctively, sensing the shift before understanding it, as a black military command vehicle came to a controlled stop nearby. The door opened slowly, and what stepped out was not just a higher rank, but a signal that the moment had moved beyond what anyone on the scene had prepared for. Because some arrivals do not interrupt the situation, they redefine it entirely. The atmosphere shifted the moment the black military vehicle came to a complete stop, its presence cutting through the ordinary rhythm of the street like a line drawn between uncertainty and understanding. The man in civilian clothing remained where he was, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, as if the arrival had been anticipated long before it became visible. Around him, the officers adjusted subtly, their earlier confidence replaced by a quieter tension that comes when procedure meets. Something it was not designed to contain. The vehicle door opened with controlled precision, and a senior uniformed figure stepped out, his movements deliberate, his expression composed in a way that suggested he did not need to ask questions to understand the situation. He paused briefly, taking in the arrangement of people, the positioning of officers, and the man standing at the center of it all. The air felt heavier, not because anything had changed physically, but because perception itself was beginning to shift. One of the officers began to speak, attempting to summarize the situation, but his words carried less certainty than before, as if he was no longer describing an event he fully understood. The arriving commander raised a hand slightly, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement that he had already gathered enough. His gaze settled on the civilian-dressed man, and for a brief moment there was a recognition that did not belong to confusion or surprise, but to understanding. The surrounding officers noticed the change in tone immediately, though none of them spoke. The commander stepped forward with calm authority, his presence reshaping the dynamic without a single raised voice. He addressed the situation in a measured tone, requesting clarification not from the man at the center, but from the officers who had initiated the interaction. Each response they gave seemed to weigh heavier than intended, as details were repeated and examined under a different level of scrutiny. The civilian man remained silent during this exchange, his eyes moving only slightly, observing not the tension itself, but the way it was being interpreted by those involved. There was no urgency in him, no visible frustration, only a steady patience that suggested he was accustomed to waiting for systems to align with truth rather than assumption. As the conversation continued, the commander's focus shifted briefly to a secured communication device, where a verification request was transmitted. The moment stretched, not with drama, but with anticipation, as the reality of documentation and identity moved through channels unseen by those on the street. The officers waited there. Earlier certainty now replaced with a careful stillness, as if any movement might disturb the balance that had formed. The surrounding crowd remained at a distance, unaware of specifics but sensitive to the change in atmosphere, sensing that something foundational was being clarified in real time. The man in civilian clothing finally spoke again, not to assert authority, but to provide simple confirmation of identity details when asked directly, his voice calm and precise. It was in that calmness that the difference became most apparent, not through confrontation, but through contrast. Minutes passed, and the response through the secured channel arrived, altering the direction of every interaction in an instant without requiring any visible reaction. The commander acknowledged the confirmation with a slight nod, his expression remaining professional, while the officers near the patrol car subtly straightened, realizing that the situation they had engaged with was not what it had first appeared to be. The man remained composed, his focus now shifting slightly toward the horizon beyond the gathering, as if the matter at hand was not about recognition, but about resolution. And in that quiet recalibration of authority, the entire scene began to move toward a conclusion that no one present had fully anticipated when the day began. The confirmation from the secure channel settled over the scene like a silent reset, not dramatic in appearance, but absolute in effect, reshaping every assumption that had been made only minutes earlier. The officers who had initiated the encounter now stood in a different posture, their earlier confidence replaced by a measured stillness that comes when protocol overtakes perception. The commander remained composed, absorbing the confirmation without reaction that would disrupt the professionalism of the moment, his focus returning to the arrangement in front of him with calm precision. The man in civilian clothing observed everything without interruption, his expression unchanged, as if the conclusion unfolding around him had already been accounted for long before it arrived. There was no celebration in his demeanor, no sign of vindication, only the same disciplined restraint that had been present since the beginning. The crowd at a distance began to shift subtly, sensing that the tension that had gathered was no longer escalating but resolving, though the meaning of that resolution was not yet fully understood by everyone present. One of the officers attempted to speak again, but his words were careful now, adjusted by awareness rather than assumption. The commander listened without interruption, then asked a final series of structured questions that brought clarity to the sequence of events as they had occurred. Each answer contributed not to accusation, but to correction, refining the narrative from uncertainty into verified fact. The man at the center was briefly addressed again, this time with a tone that reflected formality rather than doubt, and he responded with concise confirmation, maintaining the same calm presence that had defined his entire interaction. There was a noticeable change in how space itself felt, as if the environment had shifted from confrontation to recognition, from speculation to understanding. The patrol vehicles, the uniforms, and the gathered attention of bystanders all seemed to settle into a quieter state, no longer driven by urgency, but by the completion of verification. The commander made a final acknowledgement through his communication device, concluding the necessary procedural steps, and with that action the structure of authority around the situation aligned itself into order. The officers were instructed with professionalism rather than reprimand, each directive focused on closure and proper documentation. The man remained where he stood for a moment longer, not as someone waiting for validation, but as someone observing the natural end of a misunderstanding that had required no force to resolve. The commander finally turned his attention fully to him, offering a brief and respectful acknowledgement that carried the weight of institutional recognition without unnecessary words. The exchange between them was minimal, but it reflected an understanding that extended beyond the immediate moment, shaped by years of experience in environments where clarity is essential. Around them, the street returned gradually to its ordinary rhythm, though the memory of what had occurred lingered in the awareness of those who had witnessed it. The man adjusted his position slightly, preparing to continue forward, not as an escape from the situation, but as a continuation of his original path. Nothing about his presence had changed, yet everything around him had been redefined through the process of confirmation, and in that quiet transition, the significance of identity, perception, and authority became unmistakably clear without the need for confrontation or explanation. The atmosphere continued to settle as the last formal confirmations were completed, leaving behind a quiet clarity that replaced the earlier uncertainty. The man in civilian clothing remained composed, standing at a respectful distance from the officers who now operated within a corrected understanding of the situation. There was no sense of triumph in his posture, only the steady composure of someone accustomed to environments where accuracy matters more than attention. The commander maintained a professional stance, reviewing the final procedural notes on his device before issuing a brief acknowledgement that the matter was now resolved at the appropriate level of authority. Around them, the officers adjusted their positions slightly, no longer driven by assumption but by the discipline of procedure, each movement now carefully measured as they returned to standard protocol. The civilian man offered a small nod in acknowledgement of the resolution, his expression unchanged, as if the conclusion had always been inevitable once proper verification was initiated. A moment of silence followed, not uncomfortable but reflective, as though everyone present understood without words that the situation had shifted from misunderstanding into correction without escalating beyond control. In the distance, the gathered crowd began to disperse gradually, their curiosity satisfied but their awareness sharpened by what they had witnessed, though few would fully understand the significance of the exchange they had observed. The commander briefly reviewed the chain of communication once more, ensuring that all necessary notifications were properly recorded and transmitted through official channels, reinforcing the importance of accuracy in every step of the process. The officers who had first responded now stood with a different awareness, no longer focused on what had been assumed, but on what had been verified, their attention directed toward maintaining proper conduct as the situation transitioned into closure. The man adjusted his jacket slightly, a subtle motion that signaled readiness to continue his original path, unaffected in essence by the interruption that had just concluded. There was a quiet respect in the way the commander regarded him now, not spoken aloud, but present in the professionalism of his posture and the precision of his final acknowledgement. The exchange between them ended without ceremony, as is often the case in moments where understanding replaces confusion and structure restores balance without the need for emphasis. The environment around them began to return fully to its normal state, the hum of the city reasserting itself as vehicles moved along the street and distant conversations resumed their natural flow. What remained was not tension, but memory, a brief disruption that had resolved through verification rather than conflict. The man stepped forward at last, continuing along the sidewalk with the same measured pace he had maintained from the beginning, his presence blending once again into the ordinary rhythm of the city. Behind him, the officers resumed their duties, the commander preparing to depart after ensuring full procedural compliance, leaving the scene as it should be, documented, clarified, and closed. Nothing about the moment required further explanation, Yet its impact lingered quietly in the awareness of those who had been close enough to recognize that authority, when properly understood, does not always need to assert itself to be fully acknowledged. As the scene fully stabilized and official procedures transitioned into closure, a deeper layer of recognition began to unfold beyond the immediate resolution of the interaction. The man in civilian clothing continued walking along the sidewalk at a steady pace, but the quiet around him was no longer the same as it had been before the encounter. Behind the formal acknowledgement and procedural confirmation, additional communication channels had already begun to activate within the military network, triggered automatically once identity verification reached a certain classification level. Within minutes, a secure call was placed from the regional command structure to a higher authority, not because of confusion, but because of protocol requirements tied to rank confirmation at that level of clearance. At a secured military installation several miles away, the information was received by the base command office, where the duty officer immediately recognized the implications of the notification. Without delay, the base commander himself was informed, and the tone of the environment shifted once again, not with urgency born from panic, but with the disciplined response expected when a high-ranking officer is identified in civilian conditions under civilian jurisdiction. A vehicle was prepared, not as an emergency response, but as a formal escort consistent with protocol. Meanwhile, on the street, the man continued forward, unaware of the parallel sequence unfolding behind the structured systems designed to maintain operational awareness of personnel movement. The officers who had been involved in the initial interaction had now fully returned to standard duties, though their awareness of what had transpired remained sharp, each of them understanding that they had participated in a situation that required precision rather than assumption. The commander who had arrived earlier completed his final report submission, ensuring that every detail was properly recorded within the chain of command, emphasizing accuracy, conduct, and resolution without deviation. As the man approached the next intersection, a subtle shift occurred in the environment once more as a second military vehicle, marked with official insignia, entered the area at a controlled pace. It did not move quickly, nor did it signal disruption, but its presence carried unmistakable significance. The vehicle came to a stop a short distance away, and a senior base commander stepped out, his uniform precise, his demeanor formal, and his expression immediately reflective of recognition. He approached with measured steps, not questioning identity, but confirming presence, and when he reached the man, a brief exchange of formal acknowledgement took place that carried the weight of established hierarchy and mutual respect. There were no unnecessary words, only the structured language of military protocol, confirming status and ensuring alignment of information across commands. The man responded with calm acknowledgement, his tone consistent with the same composure he had maintained throughout the entire sequence of events. Around them, the environment remained ordinary, pedestrians continuing their movement, vehicles passing through intersections, and the city maintaining its rhythm, unaware of the administrative significance contained within the moment. The base commander completed the formal greeting and then provided confirmation that transport and support were available if required, though the offer was delivered with respect rather than instruction. The man declined with a brief, controlled response, indicating that he would continue independently, a decision that was accepted without hesitation. As the exchange concluded, the base commander stepped back, offering a final respectful acknowledgement before returning to his vehicle. The convoy remained for a brief moment before departing smoothly, leaving the street unchanged in appearance but subtly altered in meaning for those few who had witnessed the interaction. The man continued forward, disappearing gradually into the flow of the city, his presence once again merging with the ordinary, though the structure of authority behind him remained fully aware of his movement and status, ensuring that what had occurred would remain properly recorded within the system of accountability and respect that governed all levels of command. The departure of the second military convoy left behind a silence that felt different from the silence that had existed before, not empty, but structured, as if the environment itself had absorbed the significance of what had just been formally acknowledged. The man in civilian clothing continued his steady movement through the city streets, maintaining the same unbroken composure that had defined every moment since the initial encounter began. Behind him, However, the systems that govern military coordination had already entered a phase of quiet synchronization, where information was no longer being verified, but distributed through the appropriate channels with precision and clarity. At the regional command center, the confirmed identity had triggered an internal status update that reached multiple levels of oversight, ensuring that all relevant departments were aware of the presence and movement of a high-ranking officer operating in civilian capacity within a civilian jurisdiction. This was not a reaction driven by urgency, but by responsibility, a reflection of structured protocol designed to maintain alignment across all branches of command. Within the base network, records were adjusted to reflect verified location data, and a standard acknowledgement notice was issued to ensure continuity of awareness among supervisory personnel. The base commander who had personally met the officer earlier had already returned to his station, where he completed a formal entry into the operational log, documenting the interaction in detail with emphasis on accuracy, respect, and procedural compliance. There was no emphasis on error, because none had been officially recorded at the institutional level. Instead, the focus remained on clarity, ensuring that every action taken during the encounter was properly contextualized within standard operating expectations. Meanwhile, on the civilian side, the patrol officers involved in the initial interaction had resumed their assigned duties, though their awareness of the event remained present in a quieter form, the kind of awareness that follows a moment of realization rather than confrontation. Reports had been submitted in accordance with local procedure, and supervisory review was already underway, not as disciplinary action, but as administrative confirmation that all steps had been properly executed based on available information at the time. The man himself continued forward through the city, his presence blending once again into the ordinary flow of movement, passing storefronts, intersections, and distant traffic signals that marked the rhythm of daily life in a large metropolitan environment. Yet within the layered structure of communication that extended beyond what was visible, his movement was being quietly tracked in accordance with standard protocol for personnel of his classification, ensuring that any required coordination could be executed instantly if needed. There was no sense of disruption in this process, only the smooth continuity of systems designed to function without interference in the absence of necessity. As he reached a wider boulevard, sunlight reflecting across glass buildings and distant vehicles passing in measured intervals, the contrast between the ordinary environment and the structured awareness behind it became more subtle but more defined. What had begun as a moment of misinterpretation had fully transitioned into a moment of confirmation, and what remained now was simply the continuation of a path that required no explanation to sustain its direction. In the broader network of command, the event had already been categorized as resolved, not through force or escalation, but through verification and alignment, reinforcing the principle that clarity, when achieved properly, restores order without the need for disruption. The man continued forward without pause, his figure gradually diminishing into the distance, while behind him both civilian and military systems maintained quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired, ensuring that every layer of structure remained informed, balanced, and complete. As the day moved forward and the structured flow of communication settled into its long-term equilibrium, the man in civilian clothing continued through the city with the same measured consistency that had defined his entire presence from the beginning. There was no alteration in his pace, no visible change in his demeanor, only the quiet continuity of someone moving within a world that had already completed its reassessment of him. Behind the visible surface of ordinary streets and civilian activity, the layered systems of military coordination had fully stabilized the situation, confirming once again that all prior uncertainty had been resolved through verified channels and properly documented acknowledgement. Within the command hierarchy, the event had transitioned from active review to archived status, meaning it would remain accessible for reference, but no longer required active oversight unless new information emerged. This procedural closure reflected the standard protocol applied when identity, rank, and presence had been confirmed beyond doubt, ensuring that no residual ambiguity remained within operational awareness. At the base level, officers who had previously been notified returned to routine duties, their attention redirected to ongoing responsibilities, while the formal record of the encounter remained preserved in secure systems as part of standard personnel movement documentation. The man himself showed no indication of carrying the weight of the administrative processes occurring behind him, his focus remaining aligned with his original purpose as he moved through intersections, gradually blending deeper into the rhythm of the city. The environment around him continued its natural progression, vehicles passing in timed intervals, pedestrians moving in intersecting paths, and distant sounds of urban life forming a continuous background that required no interpretation. Yet within the unseen structure of communication networks, periodic confirmation signals ensured that his status remained properly updated, not as a matter of concern, but as a matter of procedural respect for rank and operational clarity. In a higher tier of command oversight, brief analytical summaries were generated to reflect the completed nature of the event, emphasizing that no escalation had occurred beyond initial misunderstanding and that resolution had been achieved entirely through verification and protocol adherence. These summaries were not circulated publicly, but stored within internal systems designed to maintain institutional awareness and historical accuracy of personnel interactions across jurisdictions. The man turned slightly at an intersection, pausing only long enough to observe the flow of traffic before continuing forward, his presence once again merging seamlessly into the urban landscape. There was a quiet finality in the way the situation now existed, not as an active incident, but as a closed procedural record that had fulfilled its function without deviation. The systems behind him remained active but no longer engaged, maintaining only passive awareness as required by classification standards. What remained most significant was not the sequence of events itself, but the way it had resolved without disruption, reinforcing the structured principle that clarity, once achieved through proper verification, restores order without requiring further intervention. As he continued into the distance, the city absorbed him fully once more, leaving behind only the quiet confirmation that every layer of authority, both visible and unseen, had aligned to recognize and close the moment in accordance with its proper form. The city continued to move forward in its uninterrupted rhythm, as if nothing significant had occurred beyond the natural flow of daily life. Yet within the structured layers of institutional awareness, the event that had unfolded earlier remained precisely documented, fully resolved, and permanently categorized within official systems. The man in civilian clothing maintained his steady pace through the streets, his presence now fully absorbed back into the ordinary landscape of pedestrians, vehicles, and distant urban noise. There was no indication of urgency in his movement, no deviation from his original direction, only the quiet consistency of someone whose actions required no external validation to remain complete. Behind him, within the unseen infrastructure of command oversight, final verification logs had already been sealed, confirming once again that identity, rank, and jurisdictional alignment had been correctly established and recorded in accordance with protocol. At multiple levels of communication, automated summaries had been generated and archived, ensuring that the sequence of events existed in a permanent state of clarity without ambiguity or unresolved status. In the regional coordination network, the incident had been reduced to a structured reference entry, not because of its importance being diminished, but because its purpose had been fulfilled entirely through procedural accuracy. The officers who had been present at the scene continued their duties across different assignments, their attention now directed toward ongoing responsibilities, while the memory of the encounter remained as an internal reference point for professional awareness rather than active concern. The commander who had overseen the verification process earlier had already transitioned to subsequent operational matters, his involvement complete once proper confirmation had been achieved and documented. Within the broader military communication framework, the man's status remained visible at the appropriate classification level, ensuring that any future interaction with civilian or institutional systems would be guided by accurate recognition and established protocol. On the surface of the city, life continued without interruption, with traffic lights cycling through their sequences, pedestrians moving along sidewalks, and distant sounds blending into a continuous urban presence that required no attention to underlying administrative processes. The man crossed another intersection, briefly pausing as a stream of vehicles passed before continuing forward, his movement unchanged in tone or rhythm, reflecting a steady continuation rather than a conclusion. In the background of secured systems, periodic integrity checks confirmed that all records associated with the encounter remained consistent, with no discrepancies or unresolved flags requiring further action. These confirmations were routine, reinforcing the stability of the documentation and ensuring that the event would remain correctly positioned within historical operational records. There was no escalation, no unresolved tension, only the final state of alignment between observation, verification, and acknowledgement. As he moved deeper into the urban environment, the distinction between what had occurred and what remained became purely administrative, existing only within structured data rather than lived experience. The man continued forward until he gradually blended into the density of the city, his figure becoming less distinct among the movement of people and light, while behind him the systems that had once engaged with his presence returned fully to passive monitoring, maintaining awareness only as required by classification standards, and preserving the quiet certainty that every component of the moment had been completed exactly as intended within the framework of order and protocol. As the city moved deeper into its afternoon cycle, the earlier event continued to exist only as a structured memory within institutional systems, no longer active, no longer unfolding, but preserved in precise alignment across multiple levels of verification. The man in civilian clothing continued forward through the urban landscape, his pace unchanged, his presence steady, as if the weight of the entire sequence behind him had never altered his direction in the slightest. The sidewalks around him were filled with ordinary movement, people crossing paths, vehicles passing through intersections, and distant sounds of commerce and conversation blending into a continuous flow that required no attention to the deeper frameworks operating beyond visible reality. Within the military communication network, status indicators remained stable, reflecting a fully resolved classification entry that required no further engagement. At the same time, periodic system checks continued to confirm consistency across all archived records, ensuring that every detail associated with the encounter remained properly aligned within the established documentation structure. There was no urgency in these processes, only maintenance, a quiet affirmation that the system had reached equilibrium. The man turned slightly onto a broader avenue, where the light reflected off glass buildings in long, steady patterns, and the movement of traffic created a rhythmic backdrop to his continued progression. His expression remained unchanged, his attention directed forward, not toward what had occurred, but toward what remained ahead. In the distance, a series of public transit announcements echoed faintly through the streets, blending with the ambient soundscape of the city. Within secured command channels, final supervisory notes were appended to the archived record, emphasizing procedural completeness and confirming that all participating units had returned to standard operational readiness. These notes were not reactive, but confirmatory, serving only to reinforce the structural integrity of the documentation. Meanwhile, in civilian oversight systems, administrative summaries reflected the same conclusion, marking the event as closed without exception or pending review. The man passed a group of pedestrians waiting at a crosswalk, his presence briefly intersecting with theirs before continuing onward, unremarkable in appearance, yet carrying an unseen alignment with systems far beyond the visible environment. Within those systems, his movement remained quietly observable at the appropriate classification level, not as surveillance in the conventional sense, but as structured awareness designed to ensure continuity and accuracy of information. There was no deviation, no uncertainty, only the final confirmation that all processes had reached completion exactly as intended. As he advanced further into the city, the distinction between what had been experienced and what had been recorded continued to dissolve into administrative finality, leaving behind a framework of certainty that required no further interpretation. The environment around him remained unchanged, yet the underlying narrative had fully stabilized, transitioning from event to record, from interaction to resolution. And as he continued forward into the expanding horizon of streets and light, the entire system that had once engaged with his presence maintained only passive acknowledgement, holding the moment in permanent clarity while allowing life itself to proceed without interruption or imbalance. As the afternoon light softened across the city and the flow of ordinary life continued without interruption, the systems that had once been actively engaged in verification now existed only in a passive state of awareness, maintaining structured observation without intervention or disruption. The man in civilian clothing continued his steady progression through the urban environment, his movement unbroken, his demeanor unchanged, carrying forward the same composed presence that had defined every moment since the initial encounter. Within the layered architecture of institutional systems, the earlier sequence of events had been fully transitioned into archived resolution status, ensuring that every detail remained preserved with exact alignment across all recorded channels. There was no active processing remaining, only confirmation loops that periodically validated consistency between classified records and administrative summaries. At the same time, the broader command structure maintained silent awareness at the appropriate classification level, ensuring that any future interaction involving the same individual would immediately reference the established record without deviation or delay. The man crossed another intersection where sunlight reflected off the surrounding glass structures in a diffuse pattern, briefly illuminating his silhouette before he continued forward into the shadow of adjacent buildings. His pace remained unchanged, measured and deliberate, reflecting a continuity of motion that contrasted with the structured complexity operating behind him. In the military coordination framework, final system audits confirmed once again that all procedural requirements had been met, and that no anomalies or unresolved flags remained within the documentation chain. These audits were routine, designed not to reassess outcomes, but to ensure permanent integrity of archived events. Across multiple command tiers, the incident existed now only as a completed reference entry, accessible for historical and operational review, but no longer active in any capacity requiring engagement. Meanwhile, in the civilian environment, the city remained unaware of the depth of structured observation surrounding such interactions, continuing its natural rhythm of movement, commerce, and daily transition. The man's figure gradually merged further into this rhythm, becoming less distinct as distance increased, yet still fully accounted for. Within the silent systems that tracked classification-relevant presence, there was no tension remaining, no unresolved directive, only a final equilibrium between observation and record. In higher-level oversight systems, brief final synchronization checks were executed to confirm that all associated databases reflected identical resolution status, ensuring consistency across military and administrative domains. These confirmations were completed without delay, reinforcing the principle that once verified, structured clarity remains permanent unless formally revised through authorized channels. The man proceeded along the widening avenue, his presence diminishing gradually into the density of the urban landscape, while behind him every system that had once engaged with his identity maintained only passive acknowledgement, preserving the moment as a fully resolved state within institutional memory. What remained was not action, but completeness, not uncertainty, but alignment, allowing both the visible world and the unseen frameworks that supported it to continue forward without disruption, each functioning within its designated order. As the city continued its uninterrupted progression into the late afternoon, the structured systems that had once actively engaged with the earlier situation now remained in a fully stabilized state, operating only through passive synchronization and routine verification cycles. The man in civilian clothing moved steadily through the urban environment, his presence blending further into the flow of pedestrians, vehicles, and shifting light, as if the earlier sequence of institutional attention had never disrupted the natural order of the day. Within the secured layers of military communication, the finalized record of the encounter remained intact, fully aligned across all databases, with no active alerts, no pending review, and no deviations requiring correction. The system's focus had transitioned entirely from engagement to preservation, ensuring that the documented sequence remained consistent across all levels of classification. In command infrastructure, periodic integrity checks continued to confirm that every referenced detail remained identical in structure, reinforcing the permanence of the resolution state. The man crossed a wide intersection where the sound of traffic briefly intensified, then faded again as he moved beyond the central flow of the street, maintaining the same measured rhythm that had defined his entire passage through the city. There was no indication of urgency, no change in posture, only continuity, as though every step forward existed independently of the administrative systems still quietly aware of his presence. At the highest coordination level, oversight systems registered a final synchronized confirmation cycle, ensuring that all associated records reflected complete alignment, with historical entries locked into permanent archival status. This process required no intervention, only validation, marking the end of all active procedural relevance related to the earlier encounter. The environment around him remained unchanged in appearance, yet within the unseen framework of structured awareness, everything had already been categorized, verified, and concluded. As he proceeded along the avenue, the spacing between buildings widened, allowing more light to fall across the sidewalk, subtly shifting the visual tone of the scene without altering its underlying continuity. Behind him, the network of institutional systems maintained only passive observation parameters, ensuring that classification awareness remained intact without active processing. There was no tension remaining within any layer of communication, only the final equilibrium of completed verification and stabilized documentation. In administrative terms, the event no longer existed as a dynamic sequence, but as a fixed reference point within operational history, accessible only for confirmation and not for reinterpretation. The man continued forward without pause, his figure gradually diminishing into the distance of the urban landscape, fully integrated once again into the ordinary rhythm of the city. What had once been an active convergence of authority, verification, and structured recognition had now become a closed and permanent state of record, maintained across systems with precision and without deviation, allowing both the visible world and the unseen frameworks that supported it to proceed forward in uninterrupted alignment. As the final layers of the day settled across the city, the structured systems that had once been actively engaged in verification and coordination now existed in a fully completed state of resolution, maintaining only passive integrity checks to ensure long-term consistency across all archived records. The man in civilian clothing continued forward through the urban environment, his movement steady and unbroken, gradually merging into the increasing distance and density of the cityscape. Within military communication frameworks, the encounter that had unfolded earlier remained permanently recorded in its finalized form, accessible only through authorized channels and maintained without alteration or ambiguity. There were no active alerts, no pending evaluations, and no further procedural requirements associated with the sequence of events, as every layer of documentation had already been synchronized and confirmed across all levels of command. At the highest tier of institutional oversight, a final consolidated review cycle had been completed earlier in the day, reaffirming that all data points, identity confirmations, and jurisdictional alignments were fully consistent and permanently secured within the system's archival structure. The purpose of these final checks was not to reassess outcomes, but to ensure that historical records remained structurally identical across all connected databases, preserving absolute clarity without deviation. Meanwhile, the city itself continued its natural rhythm without awareness of the extensive coordination that had occurred behind the visible surface of events. Pedestrians moved along sidewalks, vehicles maintained steady flow through intersections, and the ambient sound of urban life continued uninterrupted, forming a backdrop that required no interpretation beyond its immediate presence. The man crossed another wide stretch of roadway, briefly illuminated by the shifting angle of afternoon light reflecting off nearby buildings, before continuing forward with the same calm and deliberate pace. His expression remained unchanged, carrying no visible trace of the structured institutional processes that had followed his identity through multiple levels of verification. In the background systems, all classification references associated with his presence remained active only in passive awareness mode, ensuring continuity of recognition without operational engagement. Periodic automated checks confirmed once again that every associated record remained fully aligned, with no discrepancies detected across any archived or live monitoring layers. These confirmations reinforced the stability of the entire documentation framework, ensuring that what had occurred earlier in the day would remain permanently integrated into institutional history as a completed and resolved sequence. As he continued deeper into the city, the distance between him and the earlier location of the encounter increased steadily, reducing all remaining associations to pure record-based status. Within the command infrastructure, no further communication was required, as the event had fully transitioned into its final state of closure, where observation persisted only as background awareness rather than active oversight. The man's figure gradually became less distinct among the flow of people and movement, until he was fully absorbed into the broader continuity of the urban environment. What remained behind was a fully stabilized system of records, confirmations, and synchronized acknowledgments, ensuring that every layer of authority, both visible and unseen, remained in complete alignment, preserving the moment as a finished and unalterable point within structured operational history. As the final hours of daylight settled across the city, the entire sequence of events that had unfolded earlier in the day existed now only as a completed and fully stabilized record within multiple layers of institutional memory, preserved without alteration, without ambiguity, and without the need for further review. The man in civilian clothing continued his steady movement through the urban landscape, his figure gradually blending into the natural flow of pedestrians, vehicles, and shifting light that defined the late afternoon environment. There was no indication in his presence of disruption or emphasis, only the same quiet continuity that had carried him from the beginning of the sequence to its conclusion. Within military coordination systems, the encounter had long since transitioned into permanent archival status, meaning that it no longer required active monitoring, only passive confirmation of structural consistency across all synchronized databases. At the highest levels of command oversight, a final integrity cycle had already been completed, ensuring that every associated record, identity verification, and jurisdictional acknowledgement remained perfectly aligned across all secure channels. This final cycle marked the absolute closure of the event within institutional frameworks, confirming that no unresolved elements remained and that all procedural requirements had been fully satisfied in accordance with established protocol. Meanwhile, the city itself continued its ordinary rhythm without awareness of the extensive systems operating beneath its surface, maintaining its natural flow of movement, sound, and activity as if nothing beyond the visible world had occurred. The man crossed another intersection as the light shifted toward evening tones, casting longer shadows across the pavement and surrounding structures, while he continued forward with the same steady pace that had defined his entire passage through the city. Behind him, within secured networks, automated systems performed final synchronization checks, verifying once again that all archived entries remained consistent across every layer of documentation, ensuring permanent stability of the recorded sequence. There were no active processes remaining, no further notifications required, only the quiet assurance that every component of the event had reached its intended conclusion without deviation. The man's presence within classification systems remained preserved only as a historical reference point, accessible through authorized channels, but no longer engaged in any operational capacity. As he moved farther into the distance, the distinction between immediate experience and recorded history became fully resolved, leaving behind a unified structure of confirmation that required no further interpretation. The environment around him remained unchanged in its appearance. Yet within the unseen frameworks of institutional awareness, everything had already been finalized, synchronized, and sealed into permanent record. In that final state of equilibrium, both the visible world and the structured systems that supported it continued forward independently, yet in complete alignment, preserving the moment as a fully completed sequence within the continuous flow of time.